Good afternoon. Welcome to one more episode of AwakeNomada. Today we have Ollie. In this new season, as you know, we are touching more the deeper side of the human being and what this experience is, our spirituality, our practices, and Ollie is a really good man that I'm happy to have because I don't get to have a lot of male energy here. So this space is yours. I want you to present yourself, to tell us a little bit about you as Ollie, then as a professional, and then we will have some questions for you.
Awesome. Thank you, Paula, for having me on. And I'm really excited to share some of my story and some of my passion that's sort of led me to this point in my life. I'm a former professional rugby player. I retired from the game 10 years ago, and then I've transitioned into holistic health in the last decade. And it's been a process of unlearning and unfolding myself in terms of who I am at a much deeper level. Okay. And my work is really now informed through a trauma lens. And just to, I guess, give some context in terms of my own resolution in this, is that there's a beautiful quote from Peter Levine, which says that trauma is a fact of life. However, it's not a life sentence. And for me, that's made me have more clarity on what's important in my life and how I can overcome challenge. And that maybe when we're stuck in these states of dis-ease, which I was personally for a long, long time, after professional sport, during professional sport. And I think having this ability to move through trauma-based responses, which can be lodged in the nervous system, which we'll speak about today, is giving me a lot of clarity and also motivation that I can resolve a lot of things on a much deeper level. So my work now is informed through the trauma lens, also through the nervous system and how we can adapt and we can thrive and flourish when we are given the correct conditions. And now since rugby and since retiring, I've now moved into one-to-one work where I help people on a more therapeutic basis start to resolve and uncover some of these stuck parts of themselves through a mind-body approach.
I'm curious in the transition from being a rugby player to now being a healer. How was the transition and what did you experience while you were a rugby player? Because that is a really tough game, like literally physically is really demanding. So how did you transit and became what you are now, and why did you make that decision?
During my time in rugby, I was exposed to high amounts of stress for the best part of the decade. And I was stuck in these prolonged states of the nervous system where it was either fight, flight, or in a collapse 3 state. And that showed up and manifested itself as physical dis-ease in the body. So from mood irritability, holding of contractual patterns in my body and minds, sleep insomnia, and all these lifestyle interventions that were not allowing me to be at my very best. And throughout my course as a rugby player, I was given a very intense regime, and the combative side of rugby was very, very intense. And I think, not having the tools and techniques, I think at that time in my life, it didn't allow my body to self-regulate, to recover, to be able to perform at my best. Because when we're pushed to our limits, when we're pushed to our limits as human beings, it's really difficult to come back into more contemplation and more resolve. So I think it's, for me, it's been around how can I use the work from rugby, which taught me a lot around discipline, work ethic, strength, physical strength. Then how then can I add more fluidity and more flexibility through this work, through the lens of the nervous system, and understanding that we can become stuck in any trauma response, and there's no shame to ever be stuck in a prolonged response, whether it's anxiety or depression. It's knowing that the organism, that's the human, trying to keep us alive and safe. And in that moment of our lives, that might be the best thing for us as a protective part of ourselves. And for me, I was stuck in fight, flight for a long time. And I experienced lots of anxiety. And now understanding more around my own nervous system, how that showed up is lots of contraction. in my body and lots of irritability, and my body was very restless. And I think the work I've done since rugby has really, I guess, given my nervous system an opportunity to come into more rest and more reciprocity, which is taking time to unwind. And it's also viewing that part of my life with deep compassion, that I was under very intense conditions. I had to perform. It was a very, very big part of my life. Growing up, all I wanted to do was play rugby. It was like my dream. Okay. And I think it's just knowing that wherever we're at in our life, whether we're playing sports or in business or navigating the experience of life, that we're always going to get stuck sometimes. And it's okay to get stuck. It's just knowing that we can transition back into more fluid states in the nervous system when we become more aware and we action some more skillful work around it. So I think the transition for me has been a lot around self-investigation, exploring what's possible. And I think having a huge amount of hope and respect and reverence for the nervous system, that we're never completely stuck if we don't want to be. That there's always a part of us that can come into more flexibility and adaptation if we give it the conditions, which is slow and nurtures conditions. And I think it's a misconception that we live in a world where we believe, especially in the more healing space and self-improvement, that we have to be adding more things onto the day. We have to be doing more practices, more modalities, and we're almost exhausting a system which is already at challenge. It's burdened, it's overwhelmed, living in the society that we live. So I think the more I've learned and the more I've unlearned, the more I've recognized that it's really much around the smaller actions in the day. It's the micro decisions that make the difference. And that could be the smallest intervention, from breath awareness to orientation to checking in with my senses to grounding to all these amazing tools and techniques, which haven't really meant I'm adding more onto the day, just integrating more.
Okay. Was there any experience that got you to be more aware of your nervous system, of your reactions, of this irritability that you talk about? Because I have been there in some point of my life where I'm not aware of myself. And I am sometimes, like, we're just automatic walking, like not thinking on how can our behavior can affect our body. So I remember my step forward when I became aware of what I was doing to damage my body. And obviously that was in a very superficial level, but that was the beginning. Did you have anything like that? Like something that says, okay, I have to switch, I have to change?
I think it was an accumulation for a long time. And I think it was getting to a point post rugby that I was starting to recognize that my health wasn't balanced. My mental and my physical health, they weren't in communication. There wasn't this symbiotic relationship. Okay. And I started to experience, stuckness in the day when there wasn't much flow, but also recognizing that there is going to be challenge, and that can we meet challenge with more balance, and can we facilitate more balance through a deeper understanding that we have to experience stress in the day. Yeah. Stress is a vital component to our experience as human beings. And it's knowing that the stress response is designed to be very, very short. It's designed to be very, very acute. And it's designed to flood the system with the essential chemicals to then meet that stimulus with the appropriate response. And it's knowing that once we have that acute reaction, can we come back to baseline? Can we come back to recovery? And what was happening for me in my system was that I was in challenge, whether that was a work challenge or different challenge in the day. Mm-hmm. And I felt like my system was almost not regulating itself. And it was almost just accumulating what's called incomplete cycles of activation. Okay. So when there's a stressor, we have this process from the brain which sends different chemicals from the brain through the body and vice versa. And once that process happens, we're meant to complete that cycle. So the body is meant to recognize that we've almost escaped the threat, or we've moved away, or we're safe again. And if that isn't aware on a much deeper level, then what happens is the nervous system will start to contract and then hold. So it won't move in like a wave and a tide. So I think there's a really beautiful way of thinking of the nervous system like a tide. So we're either expanding or we're contracting. Mm-hmm. And when there's a stressor, there's a contraction because we're having to meet that demand. Cortisol's getting triggered and adrenaline's getting triggered. We have to meet that stimulus. And what's important is that, like all animals in the wild do this, that we complete the stressor by going back to contemplation. And when we don't find contemplation, then the nervous system, the tissues, the fascia will start to hold. And the more we hold and we have these incomplete cycles of stress, then that shows up as lethargy, muscle tension, soreness, pains in the body, migraines, headaches, IBS, because the body on some level and the mind hasn't come into contemplation. So the more we can find resolve through, somatic resonance, through somatic awareness, we can start to fluidly move through this tide, which is contracting, expanding and contracting fluidly as much as possible. So I think for me, for a long time, I was in contraction because of my work. And then I had that habitual pattern ingrained in my psyche that then I then started to then reflect that in all parts of my life. And I wasn't able to then move this more fluid, transitional way of living. So essentially this also speaks to the fact that humans have, this cognitive part of our brain that other animals don't have. Yeah. So when other animals are in threat or danger, they'll move away from that stressor or threat, and hopefully they'll move into contemplation, and then they'll carry on with their everyday existence. For human beings, because we have a very analytical part of our brain, we start to rationalize that stimulation. We then try to cognitively work our way through that, and it's impossible to work through stress cognitively. So it's only when we integrate fully the body and the mind can we find safety again. And once we're in a safe space, mentally and physically, then we find resolve, we go back into balance, we find homeostasis, which is all around the body's systems finding balance. And it's really given ourselves, I guess an awareness that the body and the mind really is an animal, and it's an intelligent animal if we allow the intelligence to resolve these things more naturally. But because given the conditions that we live in as human beings, we're never really allowed to process because of the way we live our lives, because we're moving through the world from task to task, and we never really enable the body and the mind to really resolve these incomplete cycles of stress. So it's not to say that we can't safely bring those discharges back up, because they're almost charges in the body that are stimulated and require space for them to fully be discharged and then to move back into a more fluid state in the nervous system. Okay.
So obviously we live in a city, so it's different than when you live in countries. I think are a bit more quieter, but for someone that lives in here and has a stressful life, one of your clients per se, what would be the recommend after they have a stressful day, for example? Because your symptoms and stuff started because of a sport, but lots of people in the cities for various reasons. So what should you do to get into that flowy, more flexible kind of state to help your day, like a practice that you could do for a short time and then help?
So a really good start is to recognize that we have a spectrum of arousal, that we have hyper-aroused states, which is more fight-flight, and hyper-aroused states, which is more our freeze and collapse and rest states. And throughout the day, moment to moment, we're moving between states of arousal. And this is a continuum, and they're blended states as well. And it's recognizing that as human beings, we're either moving towards activation or deactivation. And especially if we live in a city in an urbanized climate, that we're perhaps maybe leaning some more activation because of the natural stimulus around us. So it's recognizing that the more we activate, can we come into healthy activation, because we need that activation to meet challenge, but then can we move into deactivation? And it's almost honoring the fact that, you know, we have to move fluidly through this state, which is called the window of tolerance, which was developed by Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist. And it gives us that insight as human beings that once we meet activation, we essentially need to come back to what's called our socially engaged part of the nervous system, which is, if there's a scale, 0 would be freeze and collapse and numbness and withdrawn. 5 would be engaged, resourced, open, aware. 5 to 10 would be our fight flight activation. And we want flexibility, we want coherence, we want energy and stability in the nervous system to move fluidly through that scale. So I think the first step for anybody, regardless if you live in an urban environment or the countryside or nature, is to recognize that we have a duty and awareness to move through the autonomic ladder, through these states as fluidly as we can. And, you know, the 3 primary states are, you know, socially engaged, or fight, flight, or freeze and collapse. And then there's blended states. So there's a really important blended states that we all typically play in different ways, which is a fawn response, which is actually shows up as people pleasing. So we're engaged, but we're also slightly anxious and we're slightly activated. And it's just recognizing that that's a modern day state, because animals don't have that state. They're not trying to people please in the wild. And it's just recognizing that, you know, what is a healthy state for us as individuals. And sometimes we have to be in fight flight. Sometimes we have to be in deactivation, but the skill is that, can we be in the more aroused part of the spectrum, but can we still be aware and grounded in that space? And can we be in collapse and freeze, but can we actually rest in there? Because there's a difference between being, you know, in the freeze part of the nervous system, but being very withdrawn, very isolated, and that could show up as loneliness, shut down. But also similarly, we could be in the shutdown state, trying to rest, but be activated still, and be anxious and not be able to really rest in that. So to really truly rest is just as much a skill as it is to truly activate. And I think it's this ability to, again, move flexibility, have what's called response flexibility. And response flexibility is that we can spontaneously move between the internal world of thoughts, feelings, sensations, and the somatic intelligence and what's happening from the communication body to mind, and then what's happening around us, and that would be our external world and the moving objects, the people, the situations, the places, the belief systems, the societal narratives. And then how then can we have flexibility and adaptability between these two worlds to meet the response in the most flexible, adaptive way? And it's a skill, and it's not about attaining perfection. And there's going to be times where we do experience rage, anger, hopelessness, which is really, really important. And it's recognizing that it's absolutely okay. It's really, really valid to be in that space. And I think just to touch on, that's where perhaps modern day spirituality, quick fix healing, this approach to, you know, do more, whether it's more breathing, for example, more conscious practices, you know, we kind of lose that real humanness side to us, which is very raw, which is very much around coming into contact with all the wheel of emotions, from rage, despair, to anger, to frustration, to happiness, excitement.
I think when these emotions come, whatever it is, even if it's good or bad, as we call them, we need to be able to experiment, to feel them. And I think we don't allow that in our day-to-day as well, because of the running or doing that we are set of. Like, we don't allow ourselves to feel. And I think as well that to be able to heal the nervous system, you need to allow those emotions through. But how is the question?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because as children, we've never been taught how to feel our emotions. We've never been taught how to access the body. And so as adults, that shows up as disembodiment, and that shows up as a mind-body disconnect. And for a long time, throughout history, we have disregarded the body for lots of different reasons, through religious reasons, through seeing the body as a sin. In the Victorian times, the body would have been abolished, and we've given our bodies away to war. We've sacrificed our bodies. We've used the body as a object. We've examined the body. We used it for medical purposes. We've used the body for diet, for exercise. And so we've disconnected ourselves, our emotional body, from these paradigms that are related to this very objective approach to the body. And I think where we're coming back to now, in this rise in somatics and this rise in the mind-body connection, is that actually the body is a subjective experience. And that when we start to really come into what's called the felt sense, where we start to recognize the physiological responses in the body and all the communication around that, we can start to come into contact on a much more broader and deeper level. And for a long time, if we go even further back, again, when Sigmund Freud first began Freudian analysis, at the time there was a doctor and a student called Dr. Janet Pierre, and he was one of the founders for body psychotherapy, and believed at the time that the ID and the ego, which was the Freudian concepts, was that the ID and the ego was actually in the body, in the unconscious. And for a long time, Carl Jung also had a similar approach, but also disobeyed and removed the concept that the body has this wisdom and has this intelligence. So for a long time, for years and years and years and years, all that research which was done on body psychotherapy in the 1930s was, put to the side. And it's only now in 2004 that we're seeing a rise back with the importance of the body in research. And there was a few pioneers in the space. Wilhelm Reich was speaking to body armoring, early as well, around how the body holds these postural patterns, how the body manifests itself as tension and dis-ease in the body. But again, we were so disconnected because of the cultural belief of what the body is for. So we are really catching up now, and the work of Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory and somatic experiencing, and Peter Levine, and all these great pioneers are now starting to bring to light, research, evidence-based practice, that without the body and the intelligence of the body, there is no bridge. There is no bridge to holistic health. There is no bridge to actually well-being, because we've lived in a very mind-centric space for such a long time, where, especially in the West or modern world, where we have, really used the mind in a very potent way. And if you look at traditional CBT and therapy, it's very top-down. So it's very much examine thoughts, examine beliefs, go back into associations and memories, but it's disregarded the body. My passion is recognizing that we've lived in a very mind-centric space for a long time, and that there's the recognition of indigenous wisdom, of Eastern practices that have been around for thousands of years, that have integrated the mind and the body on a much more holistic level. So I think it's really important that, given that we've been through a very separate part of ourselves, that we've disconnected the mind and body, that we can start to weave and use the tapestry of indigenous cultures, of more holistic practices, that are more nature-based practices, that really come into contact with the body. And that we aren't, this head floating on top of the body, and that the body has all this information, and, especially through the lens of the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body. It has two key branches which run from the brain stem through the heart, through into the lungs. And then it has another branch which goes subdiaphragmatic. And what happens is it's like a relay system. So it's passing information and energy from the body to the brain to be processed and then back down. And so we're constantly receiving information through the vagus nerve, through the senses, unconsciously, millions of bits of data all the time. And the body is giving information to the brain on two really key things: is, are we safe? And is there a threat in our environment, unconsciously? And that's why we feel sometimes when we go into a room and we feel that's like sense in the stomach, that something's not quite right. You know, and that's the nervous system giving the brain feedback. And that's through the lens of the nervous system, that's through the vagus nerve. And we can start to listen on a much deeper level, which is a really difficult skill, I think, as modern day humans, because we are living in a world which is based around aversion, where we're trying to move away from discomfort, or we're trying to move away from what is in this moment, and that's really, really present. And then also we're craving. So we're trying to, we have a desire, we're trying to move through the world, and whether that's a healthy desire or unhealthy desire, either way, we are sometimes bypassing and not listening to the deeper embodiment, what and all the information that's being passed from the body to the mind and back down. So unconsciously, we're always trying to receive information from our outside world, which is then being processed. And when we start to listen to the body on a much deeper level, which might sound abstract, and how do you listen to your body when we have a body here and we can just feel ourselves, but simply things like, what's happening in the jaw? Is there holding in the jaw? Has my posture changed? Has my shoulder closed? Has my heart rate increased? Has my breath increased or decreased? Am I holding my breath? I'm just giving some small cues here. And then we can go further, we can travel into the body, and then we can start to experience sensation. And we can start to think about a texture of the body, a shape, a size, a color. And that takes practice, of course. And the more we start to, you know, relate this to, say, persistent pain or chronic pain, for example, where there's a belief that the sensation is stuck and it can't move. Let's take a bad back, for example, and it can come and go, and it can be very, very prevalent. But when we start to safely travel into the body, when we start to actually safely travel into the body and experience that sensation for what it is, we'll recognize that the sensation, when we really sort of explore the subtle changes, is always moving. And it's never quite still, which then sends a message to our brain that we're safe, starts to reduce the fear circuits. And we have a really interesting, you know, there's a really great theory called the pain gate theory. And basically what it speaks to is that the spine either opens or closes, which is at the top of our neck here. And when there's a pain in the body, that spine, that part of the gate will open. Sending more pain receptors up and down through the spine. So for a long time, we thought that the spine was only there to receive information and emit information. Now we know that it can modulate pain. So when we start to experience the sensation, what we'll do is we'll start to close the gate, which is in the spine. And then we tell the brain and the body that we're safe. So over time, with a multifactorial dimensional approach to healing, we can start to turn down and rewire some of the pain circuits in the brain. I'm just using pain as an example, because it's quite a common thing that we'll all experience at some point, is persistent pain or neck pain or a migraine. And it's goes against, it's quite, I guess you could say it's quite counterculture again, because, you know, when we think about discomfort, we either think about moving away, like I said, about aversion, or we think about craving something or trying to move and not allow ourselves to just stay in the space and experience what's called a stress tolerance experience. And then the more we start to work in that space, the wider the capacity gets for discomfort. And that's why I think for a long time, and still very prevalent, is, you know, things like the cold water, for example, because we're going into a controlled stimulus which is uncomfortable, and we're improving and increasing the capacity for stress tolerance and stress resilience. But we can do it on a much more subtle level when we start to experience sensation and we start to notice what's happening in the body. And that sensation, pain, thoughts, feelings, they're transient. And that transient thoughts and physiological sensations is is vital and critical feedback for us as human beings. And it's a skill. It's called somatic tracking or focalizing, or, you know, somatic experiencing when Peter Levine integrates this work. And it's really, you know, the somatic or the soma is the body, and it's the felt experience of the body. And when we start to experience the felt, the felt experience on a much deeper level, then we can start to work with the sensation, with curiosity, with lightness, and not being judgmental to what's happening in that moment. Again, it's slightly counterculture, because it's not about rushing. It's about slowing down, being present, and noticing what's happening in the body and mind.
Well, that's essential to be in balance, but it's a bit complicated with the lifestyle that we have now. My question is going backwards a little bit, and is, when did you start to work with the body and with all of this you were telling us? Because you stopped playing rugby, you said 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Were you learning while you were playing, or you learned afterwards, or that was part of your, from, like, I don't know, your education as a sport?
I've had a very keen interest in the body from a younger age. So I did lots of movement, dance, gymnastics growing up. So my interest was always in movement, I think, in general, motion. And then I think as rugby progressed, I went into more rigidness around structure, strength and conditioning. And about 17 years ago, I did my personal trainer qualification. So I got more interested in helping people develop strength, fitness, motor abilities, which come under that umbrella. And then post rugby, I got more interested in injury. So injury prevention, rehab, and worked in quite a few physio practices and clinics, which gave me a deeper insight into rehabilitation. And then it started to unfold deeper. So I feel like now I'm still uncovering, but it feels like I started with the physical body. So the tissues, the joints, what's happening from a biomechanical standpoint with the system. And now it's progressed into the emotional body, and what's happening in the holding of emotions. How are we expressing emotions? How are emotions moving through the system? And how does that correlate into movement and the somatic work? And then it seems to, you know, gone on again into the neurological body. So now how the nervous system interacts with movement, with emotions. And then there's the lymph, and then there's the fascial system. And then, so we have essentially all these different bodies that are all almost layered and meshed and then woven in between this tapestry through fascia. Really, fascia is the holding, it's the shape of the body. So fascia is the encasement of all our bodily tissues, and it has a communication network within the fascia. So when, again, to go back to when there's a response or an activation in the system, the fascia will contract and it will become dehydrated. And that's where we can experience adhesions or holding or trigger points. So when I'm doing touch therapy and touch work, when people are experiencing a chronic holding, for example, that's because there isn't movement in the fascia, not so much in the tissue or the muscles. It's all connected, but really there's a dehydration in the fascia. So once you start to work with the fascia, with the breath, with the nervous system, with the physical body, with the emotional body, then you start to then integrate and give the organism, you know, the more holistic side to therapy and treatment.
Wow. So it's really interesting to start from the outside and everything gets you in until you get to the point of things that you don't see or feel or are tangible, like physical, but then they become more spiritual, and everything is involved in this balance that we all look for. Okay, so then you started working in physiotherapies and helping people. You have your own clients as well. How about yourself? How all of this have changed and shaped you as a person and like as an individual? How do you describe yourself from 15 years ago to Ollie now?
Yeah, I think as I've touched on, it's been a process of unlearning, deepening my experience, but still retaining, I think, some of the qualities, the attributes that I had as a child, which was really around exploratory movement, multi-dimensional movement, using the floor, using different natural elements in my environment to move through. And now I think it's just layering, a more embodied sense that when I'm moving and when I'm in my body more, I'm not just performing a certain set of maneuvers or sequences. I'm starting to notice that when I'm doing certain movements, what's happening to my internal self, what's happening to my senses, what's happening to my emotional body, what's happening to my physical self. And then I think it's this kind of dance between embodiment, sequencing, progression, and the movement that I'm really interested in now is really much natural movement, and it's, I guess, unstructured to a certain degree. It's really around contact with the ground, using the spine as an engine and as an integration between the different planes that we can move through. We have this 3-dimensional being that we're in this suit here, but really there are so many more aspects that we can touch upon once we start to, I think, come into contact with the felt sense of movement. And that's where, grounding, qigong, slower based practices start to encourage that part of ourselves, that we can notice nuances, we can start to notice the body in space and in time. And then again, we're not just performing a certain set of things, because that's quite a physical expectation. So I think, it's been a process of, I think, retaining my passion for movement, but I think coming into more embodiment slowly, and it's an ongoing practice. Because it's easy for the mind and the ego of the mind, you start doing a movement practice, or you start just living for your life, and it's very easy to forget the body. Once we start to, things come up in the day, our to-do list is pretty high, so you start to go into the cognitive part of the brain very, very quickly. So through action, through awareness, through simply just noticing the body in space more often, noticing the breath. And I think the breath's a really interesting way to use it as biofeedback for the nervous system. So if, for example, my breath is activated and I'm just noticing the activation in my inhale, then potentially I'm moving into slightly more fight, flight, more anxious states that might be really required for that stimulus and that response, but it might not be. I might want to feel more centered and more grounded. So I'll observe the inhale. I'll also observe the exhale. And the exhale is really interesting because the exhale speaks to, can we truly let go? Can we truly relax in that moment? And if there is a hold in, if it's labored, if it's slightly forced, then respiration, the mechanics of that might be slightly inhibited. So I think it's the breath is a wonderful way to become more embodied. And this isn't about adding more techniques, more tools. It's about noticing what's happening to the breath, because the breath is always self-regulating itself. It's a behavior. It's not something that we can interrupt and intervene too much with, because the breath's meant to be acrobatic, it's meant to be flexible. But there's also times we want the breath to be more fulfilled and more centered and more fulfilling. And I think we can bring awareness to that, and we can change state, physiological, psychological state with the breath, moment to moment, which is a very important point. And it's a point of empowerment, I think, as well. So I think noticing the breath, noticing the holding of the body. So what's happening with the jaw? Where's the shoulders? Where's the posture in that moment? Is it an open posture? Are we meeting the world? Or are we slightly coming in? Then how then does that show up in a relation? Because I think whenever we're in a relation with people, it really shows us where our nervous system is in that moment. And if we're in a space of safety and it feels good, then the body language will be maybe more open, and the voice and the tonality would be softer. The parts of the middle ear will start to engage more. We have all these facial nerves which are responsible for social engagement, and we'll start to then co-regulate and mirror one another. But then sometimes we'll meet someone in our life, or we'll come into relation, and some of those features will shut down, and we'll start to close some of those features, and the middle ear will start to become more sensitive to sound. We'll become more vigilant. The posture will change. We'll start to become more defensive. And it's almost noticing that sometimes we can be in relation and unconscious things can come up. Even when we're with loved ones and friends, sometimes things can come through, even when we want to feel more engaged. And it's just knowing that sometimes there's a past experience that's come into the present, and can we start to work with that safely? But it's also there to protect us. If we're walking down a dark street, we want the ears to be tuned in. We want to be oriented to our environment. We want to be able to listen to all the sounds around us, whether they're perceiving the correct data or not. We want to be on that more vigilant state. We want to be aware and mindful. And then there's times where we want to be really rested, and we don't want that vigilance to be online. So I think when we're in a relation, when we're co-regulating with one another, then we start to really notice where our nervous system is even more, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you are in a relation is when you are more triggered, when things come out the most. But those are actually things that you may have to heal, work on, or simply the person is triggering that because of whatever behavior, like we don't know. So it's really interesting because we don't listen. We just tend to get things outside, not to, okay, why am I reacting this way? What is happening? What my body is trying to tell me about this specific situation or setup.
I think the trigger or the activation is, potentially habitual. Potentially it's happening because of a past experience, a memory or an association, which has come into the present. And then, like you said, it's getting curious. It's like asking, why is that showing up? And it's also then bringing some curiosity to it. And, when we bring space between that activation or that stimulus, that thought, that internal sensation, it's going, okay, it's alive, it's present. And it's also then reminding ourselves that we're safe and we can explore that. Again, going back to that practice of curious exploration in that space, noticing the breath. Has it changed because of the trigger? Has my body started to change because of the trigger? And once we start to create safety in the body, then the mind will start to unbind some of those habitual patterns, and we can start to interrupt some of those patterns. And neuroplasticity is around what experience can we learn through. When we learn through experience, when we have novelty, we start to create neuroplasticity, and we can also have bioplasticity. So then the biology can start to also adapt and become more fluid and less rigid. So when we have this trigger or this response, which is needed, we can start to work with the body viscerally to then impact the cognitive side for ourselves as well.
Oh, really interesting. There's lots of information.
There's lots of information.
Amazing. I mean, I think these are really simple and important points, even though you go a bit deeper in explaining why each thing, but it's important. Like the base of all of this is to be aware. Start with your physical body, which is what we can feel, which is here and present, and try to not separate the spirit of the body or the soul with the body. Everything is one thing. I know, like, you have been through a lot of changes, and we had conversations about ancestral medicine, and I know that have helped a lot, and I want to touch on that because, well, it comes from my culture, and you have been there, and I'm really curious to understand how you experience those kind of things, and how do you integrate those things in your practice as a practitioner, as a professional, and as well as an individual.
I think for me it's been so profound, so life-changing. I think just accessing the indigenous ancestral technology. I think it's going against a conditioned mind which is Eurocentric, it's mind-centric, and especially in diagnosis, prescriptions, pathology. We're always wanting to label certain things, conditions and symptoms. And I think what I've really taken from indigenous wisdom, indigenous medicine, plants, that, there's a natural emergence to healing and health and the property of that, and I think once we remove labels and we remove this idea that if we take something that's going to heal us, whether it's something that our doctor or GP has given us, and we give our power away to that, and then we're also moving into that someone needs to fix me from the outside. And I think the ancestral indigenous wisdom teaches us that we are the medicine, and that the medicine deeply resides in us, and we don't need external things to heal ourselves. And that once we come into contact with the earth, with nature, with the interconnectedness of all beings and all things in the world, we start to deeply heal on a much more grounded level. And that's not, a linear approach. It's not saying, oh, I'm just going to be fixed because I have access to ancestral wisdom and knowledge. It's recognizing that it's going to be a little bit up and down. It's going to take time. We're going to have to integrate properly. And in Western modern world, there is no integration. We give our power away to therapists, doctors, people in white jackets to heal us. And, I think the real power in healing is done in community. It's done in circle. The one-to-one is a very westernized model to healing, which is very, very valid, and it has a very distinct place, but it's also inaccessible because, it speaks to very marginalized groups of society. It's not accessible to really heal in community. And I think the power and the inspiration from indigenous culture and wisdom is that we're a one organism, we're one energetic sphere. And when we start to come into contact with community and we invite ritual, practice, and all the great things that the earth's provided with us already, then I think we can start to heal on a much broader space. So for me, it's given me huge, I think, indication of community healing, the importance of community, that we're biologically wired to connect with one another, and that healing is very valid in a one-to-one therapeutic context, and it has its place. But once that's stable, then it needs to come back into community, because it can create more isolation when there's just healings done in a one-to-one space. And I think when we come into community and there's an oscillation there, and then we can start to integrate different expertise, different backgrounds, different experiences, bring in novelty, use different medicines of the land, natural medicines to heal ourselves.
Sorry, I interrupt. I don't think it's simply the medicine itself as the plant. Going back to your point on the movement, using movement as whatever form, for me, dancing or singing, those are literally natural and medicines available for everyone. And that's something that I learned while practicing medicine. My teacher was telling me, you just sing because you want to sing. You don't sing for performance. You don't dance for performance. If you want to do so, go ahead, but that's not the purpose of it. You have to use it as an expression, as a form of liberation. So I appreciate that a lot, that there are so many things out there that we can use, and they are better done in community as well. When you do sit around in a circle and you sing, or you share, you understand that the traumas or the pains that you have or the things that you hold within are not as bad, and you are not the only one. So when it is one-to-one, I understand your point that it's valid for some time, and I appreciate and I hold great respect to the psychologists and the therapists, because that have been my beginning on all of this journey of healing. But the community setting is much more powerful, I believe, as well. I completely agree with you.
Yeah, I resonate with what you said. And I think there's a really great saying, around what shamans would have said to people when they were feeling a bit unwell. It's like, when was the last time you danced? When was the last time you sang? When was the last time you told a story? When was the last time you really, expressed yourself as a human being? And I think a lot of what we're trying to do really on a much deeper level as human beings is just express something.
Yeah.
Express the gift, express the, that really resonant part of ourselves that is being maybe pushed away for different reasons. That part that is so valid, that inner part of ourselves that was so alive at one point in our life, that natural curiosity to explore, to connect with the world around us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost reminding ourselves that we can come into contact with the child from within, this playful part of ourselves, through singing, through dance, through community. And when we're really seen, heard and held in any space, in any context, whether it's from a primary caregiver or from someone in community or someone that we just met, it's a very connected experience when we kind of come into contact with one another in a really authentic way, which is non-imposing. It's not around taking something from someone else. It's just holding a space for someone. And I don't think we have to be therapists and coaches and healers and to do that. I think it's a very basic human birthright that we need to see, hear and hold each other in the messiness of everything, and also in the lightness, in the playfulness, in life, in the ebbs and flows and all the great things, but also just to be like, okay, we're all trying our best, but can we just hold each other in that process a little bit more? And I think, unfortunately, the modern world that we live in, the societal world that we live in, doesn't lend itself to that because of the individualism approach, because of late capitalism, because of the pursuit of more desire, and kind of moving in that paradigm of like, what do we need more of versus like we have everything we need. It's just uncovering those parts of ourselves.
Yeah, I definitely agree very much. And I was surprised when I went back to Latin America, when I went back to Mexico, that I feel so westernized because I became this individualist person, which I thought I wasn't. But then comparing with the cultures of the indigenous people and the people that practices all these medicines and all these traditions, I was shocked to realize that is in here, in this part of the world, like in the north of America, I believe as well, that we all is like, just like our house, it's an apartment, it's a square where no one gets in but you and whomever you choose to, while there is like, no, you are welcome. I was shocked how friendly they were, how humble, giving, and I was like, why? I was always suspicious. Why are they doing this? What they want from me? And at one point, my teacher was like, he said, yeah, I don't want nothing. I want nothing from you. I just want you to learn what you have to learn because it's part of your culture. Just open up and learn. And I was like, okay, I will do so. But it's sad because it's what is in here. But I think if we go explore, learn, and bring those kind of settings here, it's as well possible. Like, I don't think everything is lost. I think that as it is, as London is, give us the opportunity to connect and to make things happen and to bring this knowledge and wisdom to other cultures that they don't know. I remember we having a conversation with one of your friends, which wasn't aware about this topic. And I was so shocked in a dinner we had. I don't know if you remember that. And you told me like, yeah, but this is not available for everyone. So I think if we travel, that we have the opportunity, and this it's like a privilege that we could say, when we go there, learn it and bring it and share it, that makes the difference and that help others. So yeah,
it's available if we're curious to open that part of ourselves. I think, we live in a world where information is available, it's abundant. I think what we're challenged by is a mindset that is very rigid and can be stuck around growth, around being slightly curious maybe about our past, our culture, our indigenous wisdom that's come before us.
Exactly.
And for a long time, we've abolished this information. It doesn't exist. We've pushed it to one side. We've called it taboo. We've called it, like it doesn't have context. Yeah. And really, we know on a much deeper level that this existed far first, before all the modern medicine and before the modern healing systems that are now in place. And the medical industrial complex is created a system which is really profit over health. And I think that's what we're faced with. And if people are in physical or mental discomfort, then they will naturally lean into a system that is there to be provided for. And when people start to move through that system and they start to get stagnant, they don't get the results they want, then they start to question a few things potentially, or they continue in that cycle. So the support really in the modern context isn't there. So I think what's really great, and this is the awareness that we're really interested in, is like how then do we reintegrate, and almost to the point of there's this perception that there's this maybe great awakening, that people are starting to wake up. We're starting to realize that those systems have served us to a certain point. The patriarch has served us to a certain point. We're starting to recognize that. But really, I think we're starting to recognize that it's actually a great remembering, and that it's not really a great awakening. We're just remembering who we are as human beings, as sovereign human beings, that we have the innate capacity to heal, grow, thrive, and flourish if we create the conditions for it. And I think my role here, I think, is to facilitate states of balance with people. It's less around saying, I'm going to fix you. I'm going to heal you. I'm here to guide.
Give you tools that I know.
Give you tools and techniques, for sure, but have it as a collaborative experience, which is really based around mutual discovery. And it's not around me saying that you have this and that, and we're going to do this in this amount of time frame. And sure, goals, frameworks, planning is great, but life is not linear. It's emergent. And I think we don't speak about growth like this enough, because we often think of growth as we move from A to B, and it's a very linear approach. But growth is emergent, and it's all around us. And it's only when we recognize that can we start to, I think, feed into, ourselves is like, okay, we're going to move through the ebbs and flows. We're going to climb the mountain, but there's going to be 3 stops on the way. And it's okay to stop for a while, maybe go backwards a little bit, go to the side. But as long as the compass is always kind of like moving in that direction with that intention, then I think we will see people, really start to find themselves on a much deeper level. And that's where I think we can take inspiration from indigenous cultures, which are less driven around performance, less driven around expectation, less driven around doing. It's more around being your true self, really expressing your true self and meeting your needs where they're at in that moment. So we can learn a tremendous amount from those
Thank you
cultures.
for that. This is really beautiful. I have a last question to ask, and it's about your art. Because besides being a therapist, you are an artist as well. And I want to touch base, like, what do you do? Because I know you do different things. And what this gives you as a spirit, as a soul?
It's a great question. I think for me, it's being a part of myself again that I, for a large portion of my life, sort of pushed to one side. And growing up, involved in dance, movement, and now more later in my life with sound, instruments, like doing different art experiences and creativity as a whole practice. Like, how can creativity really support me? And it's been such a supportive practice, and it's allowed me to reconnect with a much deeper part of myself that is more playful. It's open to possibilities, open to experience. It's not around conditions or expectations. It's like, this is a creative process, and can I invite in that, possibility of change, openness, exploring what is possible in that space. So I've found great joy, great fulfillment from creative practice. And I think from a nervous system standpoint as well, when I am experiencing activation, whether it's anxiety or some tension in my body, creativity is an offset to that, because anxiety and creativity and excitement are the same physical, visual feelings. So it's almost moving the energy through the body through creative practice, which is also largely very around flow, getting into high states of flow, which is like very present states, very immersive states, where time dilates, where the prefrontal cortex and the ego start to quieten down. So we come into a much more creative part of ourselves. It's more embodied. Time literally just disappears, and you end up being fully immersed, very present. And it's an activity that you're doing for the sake of doing it. You're not doing it to achieve. You're not doing it to do anything, really. You're just doing, you're inviting in the practice of creating. Yeah. So it's been, amazing.
Great. Well, you have touched loads of points about nervous system and ending up with arts now. So I want you to leave a message here for the listeners.
If there's one thing I could say to my younger self, it would be around savoring the small moments of joy in the day, appreciating the smallest moments. And these could be called glimmers. So we've always spoke about triggers, things that activate us. And I think notice the small things in the day. It could be the smallest things, like the sun in the sky, the coffee in the morning, the walk to your commute, and just noticing your surroundings, smiling at someone on the street. And I think that's the beauty of the human experience. I think that is the place of true connection to self. And it's removing this expectation of being happy, achieving self-improvement, growth, which are all wonderful things. But I think the real beauty in the human experience is noticing the really, really small things and just being really appreciative for the everyday moment, which might be very mundane, but that's what makes it human.